opening salvo in the presidential election in the United States.
Saying that they are on pace for a record-breaking night.
Too close to call.
We have an apparent winner in the Iowa caucus.
OMG, as they say. Take a look at this. It doesn't get a whole lot closer than that.
Texas Senator Ted Cruz has won Iowa's Republican presidential caucuses.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. These are some of the media stories we're following this week. Iowa, the path to the White House, and the candidates the U.S. mainstream media didn't see coming. Venezuela's economy is suffering. There's a shortage of paper to print the news on, and the government's getting the blame. Vladimir Putin and the Russian media. This time, it's personal. And why can't a country,
it's us, Canada,
run for office in another country? After countless hours of airtime, acres and acres of newsprint, multiple debates, myriad sound bites, piles of punditry, and all those polls, the U.S. presidential election entered a new phase this past week. People actually voted. Not many, about 350,000 Americans caucused in the state of Iowa, but votes were cast and delegates chosen, the first for those seeking the nomination of the two main parties for the White House. It was a bad night for Donald Trump, conventional wisdom, and the notion that media exposure amounts to political currency that candidates can cash in on at the ballot box. Trump, the undisputed media darling, finished behind Ted Cruz on the Republican side. As for the Democrats, Bernie Sanders, who the news channels paid scant attention to until very recently, ended in a photo finish alongside Hillary Clinton, the heavy favorite for the nomination. It's early, and Iowa is usually a better indicator of who cannot win as opposed to who can, but this much we do know. There's a large gap between the candidates the mainstream media like to cover and those people actually vote for. Our starting point this week is the first stop on the road to the White House, Iowa. Politicians are advised to be gracious, win or lose. Bernie Sanders was still in a virtual tie with Hillary Clinton on caucus night when he was less than diplomatic, and only for a moment, when talking about an election process that has revealed as much about the U.S. mainstream media as it has about the country they cover.
The people of Iowa have sent a very profound message to the political establishment, to the economic establishment, and, by the way, to the media establishment.
Sanders definitely made it clear and throughout the last couple of months that he felt as though the media was brushing off the movement around him, his campaign, and was paying more attention to Clinton, who everybody thought is going to be the presumptive nominee.
There's a lot of king-making, or in this case, queen-making, that goes on in the news media. They kind of pre-select the people who they think are viable, and they really give short shrift to everybody else. I was so shocked back in the summer of 2013 when the New York Times put a beat reporter full-time on Hillary Clinton. And there's been story after story, of course, about Hillary Clinton. And the public editor of the New York Times, Margaret Sullivan, just pointed out in her most recent column that the Times only assigned a reporter full-time to Bernie Sanders a few weeks ago. And given how high profile he has otherwise been in the past few months, that's kind of astonishing.
Bernie Sanders is someone who is obsessive about issues that normally the mainstream media of the United States does not care about.
The status quo is simply not acceptable.
Issues like child poverty, youth unemployment, which is almost never talked about by anyone, climate change, issues like Trans-Pacific Partnership, which corporate media almost entirely does not cover. They did not realize how much of a thirst there was among the American public for a substance-based campaign basically against the system as it exists today, the political and media system. And I think that's just something the media didn't know how to tackle.
People don't want to hear.
Didn't know how to tackle or didn't want to tackle.
What they want to know is what your vision is for America.
The issues Bernie Sanders raises, the systemic social changes he advocates, are not easily explained in the sound bites that most television news stories are built around. And that does make his campaign a challenge to cover. But when you do the math, the size of the crowds he attracted in 2015, the record number of donors sending his campaign money, and compare that with the relatively small amount of coverage he was getting, it is difficult to conclude that some of the media's indifference to Sanders doesn't come down to ideology.
It was assumed that he couldn't possibly construct a decent infrastructure in the way that Hillary Clinton did. And he's also lasted in sort of corporate-like fashion as crazy, lefty, trying to, nationalize things or something like that.
How can any kind of socialist win a general election in the United States?
Your own state can't even carry it through. How's America going to do it?
Is it really possible for someone who calls himself a socialist to be elected president of the United States?
Well, so long as Americans don't have a very sophisticated sense of what socialism might mean, even though in many cases, once explained to them, they might well approve of.
Sanders is against the agenda that probably most of the companies such as Comcast and Viacom, who own the major media networks, are for, and News Corporation as well. But I think there's also something else going on with the socialist label, which is that most people who are in the media today tend to be older folks who grew up during the Red Scare or the Cold War. And I don't think they understand that younger people under 40, we did not grow up under any Red Scare. We are not scared of communists, and we're certainly not scared of socialists who we may associate with, like, let's say, IKEA or, the country of Norway, not very menacing, images.
If Bernie Sanders raises issues the U.S. media, for whatever reason, have an aversion to, then Donald Trump speaks a language the media understand and embrace.
They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists.
He's a war hero because he was captured.
You got to see this guy. Oh, I don't know what I said. I don't remember.
The evening news broadcasts gorged themselves on Trump stories in 2015, doing more reports on him than the entire Democratic field combined. Trump went into Iowa leading the polls on the Republican side and seemed confident enough in those polls that he chose to skip a debate on Fox News.
And everyone on this stage is stupid, fat, and ugly. Now that we've gotten the Donald Trump portion out of the way.
Fox is a conservative network that Republican candidates usually court like love-struck schoolboys. And Trump looked rejected when he finished second to Texas Senator Ted Cruz.
Fox News, which has normally been kind of an untouchable place for Republican candidates, suddenly start getting attacked. Whether Trump's decision to skip the debate was a mistake or not, if you were watching Fox News after the results were coming in, they were definitely taking the tack that it was probably a mistake.
After he skipped the debate on Thursday, that late breakers were probably not going to go his way.
Cruz's campaign in Iowa being more organized than Trump's certainly played a role in how well he did, but I think the other components of that have to do with mainstream media tending always to underappreciate the role of religion in American life, and he was delivering these very overt religious messages, which I think really resonated with a lot of people in Iowa.
Trump appeals exactly to the vanities and the superficialities of the U.S. media. What they want to talk about is someone says something outrageous and lets everyone yell at each other and debate about it and shout about it, and Trump is the made-for-media candidate in that respect, and I think that's a big part of the reason he did get that obsessive coverage in this campaign, even if his candidacy doesn't end up being nearly as potent as the media pretended.
For the pundits who populate the U.S. airwaves and the sages who pen the must-read columns, having overestimated Donald Trump and underestimated Bernie Sanders, what could possibly go wrong in New Hampshire and this week's primary? But that's one of the benefits of covering an election marathon. You're only as wrong as your last story. And come November, Iowa, New Hampshire, and the conventional corporate wisdom that came undone will be long forgotten.
The way the journalists cover Iowa and New Hampshire, they can't help themselves. They know that these two places have not been particularly predictive, but they're so easy to cover. They play to the myth of the single American having political influence. They provide nice town hall meetings that are perfect for television. And so the same media who rolls their eyes over exaggerated significance given to these two places now covers those two places like a blanket in ways they never had before.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week, both the British and Swedish governments are rejecting a judgment by a United Nations panel that concluded that Julian Assange of WikiLeaks has been arbitrarily detained and should be freed immediately, as well as compensated. The UN's Working Group on Arbitrary Detention found that Assange has suffered a deprivation of liberty, given his confinement at the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he first took refuge 3.5 years ago. It blamed the prosecutor in Sweden for a lack of due diligence in allowing the case against Assange to drag on for more than 5 years, and refusing his offer to be questioned in London or online. Speaking to reporters via a video link, Assange called the verdict a vindication. The British Foreign Secretary, Philip Hammond, said the UN's findings were frankly ridiculous, adding that Assange is hiding from justice. However, as the former British diplomat Craig Murray wrote on his blog, countries who have ignored rulings by this UN panel are rare. No democracy has ever done so. Recent examples are Egypt and Uzbekistan. The UK is putting itself in pretty company. There are some clear red lines in Russian journalism. One of them is President Putin's private life and his family, and a Moscow magazine appears to be paying the price for going too far. The magazine is the New Times and is sometimes critical of the Kremlin. It was fined an undisclosed amount and formally warned by the state's media watchdog, Roskomnadzor, ostensibly over a story on Ukraine. But that same day, it published an investigative piece on its site on the private life and finances of Vladimir Putin's eldest daughter, Maria, a university official. The New Times reported that she and her husband own corporate holdings worth $1.3 billion. In addition to the fine, the magazine's website came under attack and crashed for several hours. The Kremlin has long been suspected of using hackers to silence its critics. The attacks against journalists in Afghanistan seem to be spreading. Last week, we reported on the Taliban suicide bomber who killed 7 employees of Tolo TV in Kabul. Since then, Mohammad Zubair Haksar has been shot dead by unknown assailants in the eastern province of Nangarhar. He was a reporter for the local state-owned broadcaster. 2 days later, unidentified men stormed the house of a freelance journalist, Yahya Jawahari, in Balkh province. He was badly beaten. Afghan President Ashraf Ghani has since issued a decree to protect media workers, promising to find and prosecute those responsible for the attacks. The Egyptian government's war on freedom of expression landed a cartoonist behind bars this past week, albeit briefly, and actually was commented upon by President Sisi, again, briefly. Islam Gawish was taken into custody for running a website without a license, although no one seems to know what the alleged website was. We do know the cartoonist's Facebook page, which frequently skewers government figures, has more than 1.7 million followers. Gawish was released the following day without charge, and a few hours later, President Sisi surprised a news program by phoning in and telling the host, the pro-government Amro Adib of Orbit TV, that he's okay with criticism. Sisi's done this kind of thing before, telling news outlets like CNN that he supports freedom of the press and never explaining why his government has thrown so many journalists in jail. There are big political changes underway in Venezuela. For the first time since the late President Hugo Chavez ushered in a socialist revolution 17 years ago, the right-wing opposition is now in control of the National Assembly. That would be front-page news in Caracas, except there's a shortage of paper on which to print it. One of the changes made by Chavez's successor, Nicolas Maduro, was to give his government effective control of the distribution of newsprint, a monopoly that the opposition calls a form of media censorship. In Chavez's day, the media turned into an ideological battleground. The bulk of outlets were owned by conservatives, long part of Venezuela's ruling elite, and their hostility towards Chavez was plain for all to see. Chavez made changes on the broadcast side, both regulatory and related to ownership, and Maduro has continued that trend with print outlets. But one thing that the new president cannot change is himself. He lacks Hugo Chavez's charisma. He's just not a media performer, and that, too, is part of this story. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now on the politics and the economics of the Venezuelan news media.
Paper. In Venezuela, it's a commodity in high demand, but supplies are running low. It's a story some newspapers are finding hard to cover because they've run out of paper to print on. This week, 86 newspapers announced they were out of stock and wouldn't be printing news. Most Venezuelan newspapers used to receive steady supplies of newsprint from abroad. But for over a year, the Maduro government have centralized all paper imports to this one building, the Maduro complex.
The paper shortages experienced by the press are caused by a lack of foreign currency. The result is that pages are rationed at all papers, regardless of their political leanings. So the press, and to a lesser extent TV and radio stations, also find themselves at the center of the economic crisis that the country is mired in.
There's a de facto national monopoly over paper. That means the government will reward those whose editorial line agrees with them and will similarly punish those who take a different line. For instance, the papers that are printed in the Maduro Corporation, these are all state-backed papers, and they never experience any paper shortages.
We're going to launch an investigation into the Maduro Publishing Corporation. It's become a political weapon to prevent independent media from getting newsprint. That's led to publications all over the country being forced out of business just because the government refuses to provide them with paper.
When Maduro came to power in 2013, print media became his bête noire. For his predecessor, the late Hugo Chavez, it had been TV. There were reasons for that. In 2002, Venezuela's media landscape was dominated by right-wing media to the extent that when Chavez was temporarily overthrown, coup leaders said they couldn't have done it without RCTV, Venevisión, Globovisión. When Chavez returned to power 3 days later, what ensued was a battle to redraw the Venezuelan media landscape.
President Chavez was right. Back then, the majority of the media were in the hands of rich, powerful groups who had full editorial control. This has changed.
It was his intention to get rid of the old media oligarchy. That was what led to the eventual closure of RCTV, to strike a political blow against them. What we're seeing now is the rise of a new media oligarchy, which, depending on the change of government, will either maintain its critical stance or possibly align itself with the new one. After all, just like any other media company in the world, their bottom line is still turning over a profit.
All sorts of things have taken place over the past 17 years. The closure of RCTV, one of the key national broadcasters, provoked so much outrage against Chavez that they decided to take a different approach. They stopped closing down media outlets and started to buy them out.
In 2013, Globovisión was sold to businessman Juan Domingo Cordero, rumored to have close ties to the government. Later that same year, Últimas Noticias, one of the country's highest circulation dailies, was bought out by British businessman Robert Hanson. A year later, El Universal, the country's 100-year-old broadsheet, was sold to a tiny Spanish company called Ebalisticia. All three outlets had been critical of the government.
Últimas Noticias was a flagship title for one of the country's top publishers, Capriles. But today, if you take the front page of the government newspaper, Heir, and compare it to headlines on Últimas Noticias, they're exactly the same. It's like they all have the same editor-in-chief.
In terms of government influence on the media, there is no censorship at work like some people have claimed. No newspaper, TV or radio station can say they were prevented from reporting on something by the government.
El Universal had an excellent team of financial journalists, amongst the best in the country. This was disbanded because they weren't able to report on financial matters properly. Now you won't see front pages dealing with economics, shortages, inflation, people queuing for food. These are the issues that are excluded.
For the stories the government wants to include, turn the TV on. Chavez used to go on state TV to host his show A lo Presidente, 6-hour marathon broadcasts. Then he came up with Cadenas, a cornerstone in his communications strategy, party political broadcasts legally sanctioned to break into local TV programming. Maduro has done the same thing, 500 hours of FaceTime since he came to power.
que no la han parado ni la va a parar nadie.
But never as media savvy as his predecessor.
Maduro considers the majority of the press, radio and TV to be hostile to him and to his government.
Y los medios de comunicación cómplices.
He has good reason to believe that. The majority of the press around the country are opposed to him.
Mira el titular grosero y cochino que sacó el diario 2001 hoy. Ahora vienen a sabotear entonces, como hicieron en el 2002.
And this is also the case for most radio stations. It shows in the output. So I think he is justified in thinking that the majority of the media are hostile.
Estos son los enemigos de la patria.
Chávez era un gran comunicador.
Chavez was a great communicator. He had a way with his followers. This is not the case with Maduro. Nobody's buying the message that Maduro is trying to sell Venezuelans. Nobody believes it. None of it is having the desired effect. The president could be addressing people via local radio, but they're queuing up for food, so they're not listening to him.
I think that because Maduro won by a narrow margin, he's always been very concerned about what the media says about him. That's because he overestimates the influence the media have on society. The media may play an important role, but not quite to that extent.
Cuando uno lee la prensa de la burguesía, no los voy a nombrar. Ustedes se dan cuenta que ellos están en contra del plan de pacificación.
He presents the media as a de facto enemy, in spite of having a huge platform at his disposal.
When Venezuela's socialists were first voted into office, they went on the offensive against the private networks weighted against them. Hugo Chavez televised the revolution, made politics spectacle, made populism popular. But with all the changes in ownership, the redrawn media landscape, and the government now controlling, if not what news is fit to print, the paper it's printed on, the media balance has shifted. For Maduro, the media are amongst the few levers of power he has left at his disposal. Faced with an emboldened opposition and an economy in crisis, he may not be able to contain the story of a faltering revolution for much longer.
Given all of the changes in the Venezuelan media, starting at the ownership level, with resignations at outlets that are now under new management, many journalists are working through new digital outlets that offer alternative sources of information. Efecto Cocuyo, which means Firefly Effect, is a news website set up by Laura Weffer, former editor at Diario 2001. For more in-depth investigative work, there's Poderopedia, which publishes briefs and profiles on influential business figures, politicians, and military officers. Its founder, Cesar Batis, was an investigative journalist at Últimas Noticias. He digs information out from public records to carry out his work. Infocracia.org is a blog run by Andrés Canizales, an independent journalist and media scholar who also contributes to elestimulo.com, which is worth going to for political news analysis without the polarized coverage that you get in the mainstream media. Finally, the race for the White House is a story that's reported globally, but in a country like Canada, it feels like local news. Whether they like it or not, Canadians have a huge, or as Donald Trump would say, huge stake in the outcome. A Canadian comedian, Brian Calvert, and his American colleague, Chris Cannon, have come up with a novel idea. They think, given the political circus underway south of the border and the political implications for the entire neighborhood, that Canada should run for the White House. They make their case in the upcoming video. Full disclosure, I am Canadian, and I approve of this message. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
Oh, hello, America. It's us, Canada. As your whitest neighbor, we realize you don't think about us very much. But that's okay. Sometimes being on your radar isn't such a good thing. Your country is on fire, and your leaders are whittling sticks for their marshmallows. Right now, Congress is debating whether guns have the right to marry other guns. And what is this? What is it? Did America lose a bet? So we are once again declaring our candidacy for President of the United States of America. Not me, not Prime Minister Centerfold, but all of us. 34 million of the politest people you will ever meet. How will we make America better? We'll open one free daycare for every closed Planned Parenthood clinic. And we'll help you solve your race problem as soon as we figure out why you still have a race problem. So you can vote for us, or you can vote for one of those guys promising to build a wall along the Canadian border to keep out your scary neighbors. But I'll let you in on a little secret. We're way ahead of you.